Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, trying to find controversial topics that we can discuss in a respectful way and maybe just bring awareness to anyone who would listen to the podcast. And the topic for today is one that I've talked about a lot on social media and I've talked a lot about on the podcast. And I'm really stoked to have him here to talk about, to have Ben Westhoff here. He's a journalist and a writer who is very familiar with the drug fentanyl. And fentanyl, we have all heard of cocaine and heroin and all that kind of stuff, but I am shocked at how many people are still unaware of the drug fentanyl. So Ben is here, and we're gonna talk to him about what he did and what his book is. And I'm just hoping that those of you who are unaware will become aware of the things that he discovered, and we can kind of push forward some sort of plan for how to deal with this, because you can't solve a problem that you don't understand. You need to understand the problem before you can find a solution. So I think that that's what we're going to be doing today. And I just want to say, Ben, I am stoked to have you here. This is maybe the most pressing problem in America, and it doesn't get news like it's the most pressing problem in America. And there's a bunch of reasons why, perhaps, but thank you for being here. Please just introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about your background as a writer and a journalist, and then how you kind of fell into this whole world of fentanyl and opioids and things like that.
Thanks for having me, Will. It's great to be here. I am an investigative journalist based in St. Louis. I actually used to live in LA. I was the LA Weekly music editor, and I primarily wrote about hip hop music and wrote a couple books on the subject too, about NWA and Tupac, the origins of gangster rap. But while I was in LA, I started covering the rave scene there too. And particularly, I was investigating this question of why were so many people dying at raves? You know, because I'd gone to them back in the day in my 20s, and no one ever died. But now at these big festivals, you know, you have like hard music and ultra and Coachella and all these festivals, and someone would die at almost every one. And it was always blamed on ecstasy. And in my experience, ecstasy was not a particularly dangerous drug. And so I kind of went down the rabbit hole and found out that there was no pure ecstasy anymore at all, practically. What people were dying from were these adulterated new drugs. And these drugs had all these like complicated names. They were all made in China, and no one knew much about them at all. And so I ended up going to China. I did all this research on these new drugs, and there's hundreds of them, and the most dangerous of all of them is fentanyl. Like you said, it's now the number one drug killer in America. In fact, in history, it's killing more people than any drug in history. Yeah. And until a few years ago, it wasn't even hardly on the DEA's radar. And so this book, my book, Fentanyl Inc., is an exploration into how this became such a big problem.
Yeah, when you say you don't know MDMA or ecstasy to be that dangerous, just to clear that up a little bit, like this is not a promotion of drugs or anything like that, but the organization MAPS is doing a lot of studying with MDMA and especially for like people with PTSD, soldiers and things like that, and they found a lot of breakthroughs for people in their mental health by this drug that lowers a lot of your walls and your inhibitions and things like that. Or I don't know if inhibitions is the right word, but like your walls and your protective barriers and stuff like that of maybe from warfare. And you can get right at the trauma and try and flush some of that out. But when something is illegal, like ecstasy is, you don't know what's in it. There's no FDA, there's no regulating body. So if you add a little bit of this fentanyl in, then you get really high, and that seems to be like a pleasurable experience. Is that kind of what you mean? What your take is?
Well, yeah. I mean, fentanyl is put into almost every drug that can be a pill or a powder right now. So if you buy something on the black market, you think it's cocaine, you think it's meth, you think it's heroin, you think it's a prescription pill like Oxycontin, for example, and it could be cut with heroin. And they have pill pressing machines that make them look exactly like the kind you would get from CVS. So if you're prescribed by your doctor and you get it at a regular pharmacy, you'll be fine. But, you know, that's the perils of growing up and being a kid today, is that any drugs you encounter really could be spiked with fentanyl.
Yeah, you have no idea. And just going back, actually, you said that you're an investigative journalist. Um, like, is investigative journalism dying? Do you think that like objective, like you pursued this path, it seems like just out of curiosity. Like you were like, wow, this is interesting. I'm gonna investigate. Like you're like a detective, and then share what I see. That's not as like much in demand as something like this will get a lot of clicks, or this is more partisan, or this is very like this is like sexy or something like that. Do you feel like your field is dying, or is that not accurate?
It's definitely a flux period. There's no doubt. You know, in kind of the glory days of newspapers, especially in the maybe 70s, 80s or so, there were these huge budgets for investigative reporting, even in daily newspapers. And that was based partly on the fact, you know, there was no internet. People were, you know, buying ads for things that they couldn't measure if they worked or not. And then the internet, especially since all these publications went online free, that really disrupted everything. And now things are starting to kind of settle, and you have this stuff like these Substack newsletters. There's some investigative journalism being done on those. There's all this, the model is just splintering in 100 different directions. So it's definitely, things are lagging right now, though I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, because especially if you're going after something like drugs, it's not a bad guy. I mean, it's fine. You'll investigate to see, can you catch Trump doing something bad, or can you catch Biden doing something bad? If you have a clear villain going into it, like uncover some dirt on this villain, that's one kind, but that's not what you're doing. That's not what this was anyway. This was solely like, let's just find out what's going on. And that when you don't have that villain, maybe that's an element of it. Like you have these like teams that were playing this tribalism that we're trying to always, that we're trying to kind of, there that people are playing. And this one doesn't have one. This doesn't really have a bad guy. It's more complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say is that I had a friend who died from fentanyl, and that really kind of inspired me to do this in a lot of ways. But you're right. It's the war on drugs and is kind of one bad guy in this story, and sort of the Chinese government subsidizing the production of these drugs is another bad guy in this story. But when it comes to drugs, though, the drugs are always going to win. You know what I mean? Like, even if China gave up, even if the Mexican cartels somehow got out of the game, even if drugs are legalized, there's still going to be drug use. There's still going to be problematic drug use, and I think all we can really hope is just to make it safer and make people more educated.
Yeah, and that's something that I really loved about your message, and as you continue, putting it out there, is like, this is just about trying to make things healthier. And the war on drugs, the just say no stuff, all of that isn't really focusing on it being a health issue. One example you mentioned about like the pressed pills and stuff like that is when people are given opioids. So it could be for anything, for surgeries or anything like that. There is no program, there is no status quo for how do we get people off of it. I had surgeries throughout my 20s, a bunch of different like medical issues and stuff like that. And I got a bunch of Vicodin and stuff like that. And sometimes I took more than one, and I was like, or more than I was supposed to. And I was like, this is pretty great. This is pretty awesome. And then they were just like, all right, you're out now. And I was like, oh, whoa, okay. Like, I actually had the first panic attack I ever had was in the hospital. I just was cut off cold turkey from like a dilated or something like that drip, and I was going through kind of some withdrawals, and I was put in a like an MRI machine. I was just freaking out because they just didn't weed me off at all. Like, why is there not some sort of, hey, this person's been on these opioids for a while because of arthritis or whatever, and now they're off of them? It's like you're on your own.
Yeah, there's definitely starting to be a sea change in the way that opioids are prescribed and administered. And some people think it's actually happening too quickly. And there's people that have been on opioids for health reasons for years. Now, this is a complicated issue because, once you're on strong opioids for something like 6 weeks, longer than that, you're not really helping the problem anymore. You're just sort of maintaining your addiction.
Yeah.
But at the same time, just taking those people's pills away is an even bigger problem because people turn to street heroin and street fentanyl, and that's a big reason for the opioid crisis in the beginning. And then, taking it full circle, in a lot of European countries, they actually prescribe heroin, like pure heroin from your doctor to maintain addictions. And so the issue it's not always so cut and dry. The problem is that once you have an opioid addiction, like weaning off of it is like its whole separate, a whole process of its own.
Yeah. If the audience isn't familiar with fentanyl, here's the way I describe it to my class. Let me know what I might be missing here or fill in the blanks. Cause right now I'm teaching the 1920s. So I was teaching about prohibition, and I said, America was predominantly, it was beer drinkers up until prohibition. And then because alcohol was banned and people they were bootlegging it, they had to hide it very surreptitiously to get it to the speakeasies and get it to people and stuff like that. So you get more bang for your buck. So the way I explain it to my high school students is like, if you're having a kickback in your basement or up in your room, your parents are home, you're not going to bring in a whole big case of beer clanking around. You're going to just bring one bottle of vodka because it's more potent, therefore you can get more bang for your buck. And that's what moonshine was, and that's where a lot of hard liquor came from in America and stuff like that. Now take that concept for drugs. Drugs are illegal, and if fentanyl is up to 100 times more potent than heroin, so a brick of heroin, you could get in just an envelope or something like that of fentanyl, and it's just more bang for your buck. But because of that, you are far more likely to die. I tell these teenagers, I'm like, if you absolutely have to drink, you shouldn't. Okay, wait till your prefrontal cortex is developed or whatever. But if you have to, drink beer, because it's harder to overdose on beer than it is on vodka or something like that. And that kind of plays into what fentanyl is. Why would they make something that you take and you literally die from it? Well, because it's bang for your buck. We're trying to smuggle it in, and you can stretch it really far. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it, and I think it's one of the main arguments against prohibition. The thing about fentanyl is that it wasn't really demand driven; it was more supply driven, right? So people on the streets weren't saying, this heroin, it's just not hitting the spot. We need something stronger. It was that the producers, the distributors, the cartels found that it was so much cheaper to produce, so much easier to bring across the border, because like you said, it maybe 50 times stronger than heroin. And so 1 kilogram of fentanyl is equivalent to 50 of heroin, and so it's much easier to smuggle across. And so that's for the first years of fentanyl, that's how it was. Now it's kind of maturing, and it's been in the market longer. And so you're seeing there now actually be demand on the street for fentanyl. It has differences from heroin. Heroin, of course, comes from a natural plant, the opium poppy, whereas fentanyl is manufactured in a lab. So the high is shorter with fentanyl. I've heard people say that heroin is more soulful. And another issue is that people who have been addicted to heroin for a long time, they don't get high anymore at all. They're just maintaining their addiction, getting rid of their withdrawal symptoms. But with fentanyl, they can get high again. And so it's a whole new sort of echelon of high.
Jeez. Yeah, so you talk about it being a synthetic drug. Part of that, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is the chemical makeup is essentially, if you're gonna make something illegal, okay, and this is, again, I teach government, so I talk about this stuff, if you're gonna make a law against something, you have to be very clear about what you are banning. Like you have to be very clear about it. So when you ban a drug, you have to say essentially what that drug is. It can't just be a street name. It has to be some sort of chemical makeup. So when these drugs, these synthetic drugs, all they have to do is change one little molecule. And I know you're not like a chemistry expert, but like I believe it's like you just change one little molecule or something like that. And then the DEA, they banned the one that had this molecule. It still is essentially the same thing. So now they have to chase down and you're always like one step behind, like the coyote chasing the roadrunner. You're always like one step behind because the drug manufacturer can just change a little thing and that's not illegal. It's almost like bath salts.
In the U.S., actually, under Reagan, they passed the Analog Act, and so that stated that a drug only has to be similar, either in the chemical makeup or the effect that it has, to be kind of a priori illegal, meaning before it's even created. One thing that makes this situation complicated, though, is that China does not have that kind of law. And so in China, they, like you said, their fentanyl itself was banned a long time ago. But then all these chemists had to do is just slightly tweak the chemical structure. And you had all these different analogs of fentanyl, literally infinite possibilities. So China even has finally come around to banning all fentanyl analogs. But that hasn't stopped the problem either, because the fentanyl precursors are still legal. And a precursor is basically the most important ingredient needed to make a drug. Yeah. And so what the situation is right now is these Chinese chemical companies make the precursors, the Mexican cartels buy them, they produce the fentanyl the rest of the way, which is a very simple process. And then, voila, you have the fentanyl ready to ship across the border.
Yeah. So getting into China, the scariest podcast that I've ever done was with Karu Wang, who is an educator and a bunch of different things, but she spent a lot of time in China, and she kind of broke down how China is fighting this war without guns, but it's a war against the Western world essentially. And she framed it as like it's almost a long-term payback for the opium wars. And you spent time in China. You went to these labs. How much of it was, hey, I'm just trying to make some cash to provide for my family here, and how much of it was like, we're going after America? And that can be from policy or from the individuals.
Yeah, well, people have asked me a lot about this, and yeah, as you mentioned, the opium wars. Great Britain used to sell opium to China through its East India Company, and the Chinese population was getting hooked in huge numbers. There were 2 wars over this. China lost, and that's how Hong Kong came under the purview of Great Britain for a long time.
Right.
And this was part of what the Chinese call their century of humiliation with the Japanese occupation of Manchuria and things like that. So a lot of people think it's really ironic that now this, like you said, reverse opium war, instead it's with China that's distributing this bad opioid, and the West that's consuming it. And I'm familiar with some of these sort of conspiratorial seeming aspects with China. There was this U.S. Army white paper that looked into this classified Chinese information where these generals were talking about non-traditional types of warfare against the U.S. And one of them was called drugs warfare. I tend to use more of an Occam's razor approach, at least to how this all got started. It's really, I think, about money, and what I found when I went to, I'll talk a little bit about my infiltration, but I basically just pretended to be a drug dealer. I came up with a fake name, fake email address, and I just Googled buy drugs in China. And these companies just started coming up right away. The salespeople's contact information was right on their webpage. So, because like I said, this stuff was legal in China. And I found people who owned labs who would be willing to see me. And so I went there, and I kind of just, they're used to Western, drug dealers coming by. And I don't think I played the part necessarily, but I think they kind of wanted to believe me because they wanted to make a sale. And so I actually said it was my friend who was a big drug dealer, and that I just was checking out their lab to make sure that it met the quality standards. And parts of it were very harrowing. Like I met this lab owner in Shanghai, and he wasn't really sure what to make of me. So he took me back to his apartment. He kind of like grilled me. He even said like, "Are you a journalist? We're worried about a Western journalist will come here to try to expose the industry." Um, Finally, I convinced him to take me to his lab, and he had this driver who took it, this kind of like beefy dude who I thought might have been the security. And I was sitting in the back seat. We were speeding down the Shanghai freeway. I had no idea where we were going. You know, I didn't have my cell phone because in China they don't, American cell phones don't work. So I had this like rented like little flip phone thing with no GPS. I finally we arrived to this lab, and it just looked like a regular office park. It was there was, you have the card, and the mechanical arm comes up and lets you into the parking lot. There was a fountain out front. The lab itself was, kind of like a college chemistry lab. It was it wasn't underground. There weren't like guys with AK-47s. This was just a regular business operating. And they there were these big bats of these fentanyl analogs. Synthetic marijuana was being made in huge doses, huge batches. And we kind of discussed prices, and then I left without buying anything, but I was able to kind of record our conversation on a secretly hidden cell phone. And basically, like, these companies get subsidized by the government for these chemicals, which was the really craziest thing. And in some cases, they get grants to support their work. I think these were originally started because China is trying to, increase the exports of its chemical and pharmaceutical industries. So China makes more pharmaceuticals than any other country in the world, but they're not like name brand expensive pharmaceuticals like in the US. So what they're trying to do is kind of go up the value chain, it's called, and they give incentives for exporting chemicals they perceive to be more valuable. And for whatever reason, fentanyl is on this list. Now, fentanyl is, of course, an important hospital drug, and it's you can use fentanyl legally all over the world. But this isn't the US doesn't buy any from China, and this isn't what's being sold. It's instead a lot of these analogs like we're talking about. Some of these, there's this thing called carfentanil, which is like 100 times stronger than fentanyl. It's used as an elephant tranquilizer. There's all this stuff that has no medical use at all, but these companies are selling. So it's kind of a combination. I think there's corruption, especially more on the local level. There's all these provincial leaders who want to increase, jobs, have a better economy in their provinces. And so they look the other way when it comes to these regulations. And even when they are on the books, regulations to crack down on this type of production, they don't have the sort of boots on the ground to enforce the laws. And so, at the very least, if not a, conspiracy against the West, it's kind of gross negligence and incompetence.
Yeah, but why would they subsidize it? I mean, they know what's going on. I gotta ask you, just curiosity, because you're living this life. I mean, when you're over there, that's a life that very few actually have. Are you scared? Like, how scared are you? Like, you're undercover in China, which is, I mean, China's nuts. They're doing a genocide right now. The Uyghurs, and like, I mean, it's a scary place to someone like me who's like super American. Very, if I leave here, I'm staying in a nice hotel. Like, what's going through your head when they're like, "Are you a journalist?" and you're saying no? Like, what's to stop them from just like how can you just bring us into like what's that like for? No one probably listening to this has ever infiltrated a drug lab in China. Like, what's going on in your head?
Yeah, no, I was terrified. Don't get me wrong. I mean,
but you have to keep it like you're not. right?
Yeah, yeah. The whole time I was, I'm not a good actor, so it makes it hard to play a part. But, when my wife was most worried that, I'd be put in a Chinese prison because I went over there without a visa, a tourist visa. Excuse me, I was on a tourist visa. I didn't have a journalist visa. So that right there is, I could get thrown in jail for that. But I knew if I got a journalist visa, they would have someone literally following me around.
Right.
So once I got there, I had a translator, and she helped me kind of understand the lay of the land. But
She knew
when
who you were.
what's that?
I'm sorry. Did she know that you were a journalist?
Yeah, I talked with her in advance, and
Okay.
and she was very fearless too. But once I got in this guy's car, she couldn't come with me. She was going to follow us. We thought we were going to be walking somewhere, so it was terrifying. I had to keep my cool. The thing that sort of made me relax a little bit, at least, was that they don't have a lot of guns in China. Even the police don't really carry guns. And these ultimately were not cartels. These, like I said, these are businesses trying to make money. Like, killing an American is going to really blow up their spot and
Yeah,
be
that's
bad
true.
for business. But these are all sort of more intellectual exercises. And when I was in the moment, I was, but it may be a little sick, but that's kind of like exciting for me too, and in the type of work that I do. It was
Yeah.
kind of thrilling at the same time.
Yeah, that's funny though. Like we do like go to like that intellectual place of like, well, if they kill me, it's gonna be bad for them. It's like I've talked to like
Yeah,
people who like, oh, if you hit me, then I'm gonna sue you. If you run me over, then I'm gonna sue you. It's like you might be dead. You might be dead. Like this stuff could happen, and it could blow up their spot. But in the same time, like you're not around to see it. It takes balls, but you really felt that this was worth it. You looked at the numbers. The numbers are horrific. I mean, it's how when we look at these numbers, like whatever 60,000 people died last year, and I think with COVID, it's probably going to be higher now. But like when we look at these numbers, how much of that is fentanyl? It's a lot, right?
yeah. We're setting records every year. In 2020, the numbers aren't in yet, but that's going to be the worst year
It
for
will.
drug overdose deaths by a long shot. And COVID is definitely exacerbating the crisis, like you said, because people aren't able to get the treatment. It's the worst case combination of joblessness and kind of despair and not getting access to treatment. So yeah, fentanyl is far and away the most deadly drug, and it's it's not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse. In fact, in California, it's just starting to get there. In the eastern United States and the Midwest where I live, it's been a problem for a number of years. In some states, it's actually getting better. But California, the crisis is just beginning. And I'm hearing so many reports. And speaking of young people, these fake pills, these like blue Percocets, are like an epidemic down there. San Diego, LA County, people are really, kids, they think that it's a prescription pill. You get it from a doctor, so it must be relatively safe.
Right.
And people are just dying all over the place.
Yeah, they make it look just like the ones that you get from your doctor. So when the early OxyContin producers and stuff are like, oh, it's not that addictive. Well, clearly it is, because I mean, for a million different reasons, but clearly when the drug dealers are making their illegal drugs look just like your drugs, then there's something there. Like I think with the TV show Trafficked, Mariana Van Zeller, she was saying like even like in Central America and Mexico and stuff, they still get the precursors. They're making fentanyl down there, but they're getting the precursors from China. China dumps them off a boat in these big barrels, and it's coming from China. So now I'm seeing these patterns, just as like a layperson, of the bot farms trying to just sow discontent and division in this country through social media and stuff like that. Those are linked to China. The drugs being pumped in and killing more Americans than pretty much anything else is from China. Like, this is why there's these factions in politics saying like China is a problem. And it's not Chinese people. It's the communist state of China who was who's playing a very, dirty game, and we're America, we play dirty games too, but they're playing a very dirty game to try and take a powerful position on the world stage. That's it's a scary thing, because what can we do? What can we do to another country that's doing this? Because there's clearly a want and desire here. How do we crack down on this? I know you've talked about testing and things like that. I'm throwing a lot at you, but essentially just first with China, I guess. Like, what do you see as a solution? You know more about this than a lot of people, including people probably in Congress. So what would you say would be like a solution just for dealing with the way China is playing their role in this with America? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I remember, especially around maybe the George W. Bush Gulf War, the Iraq War, rather. You could hardly travel in other countries, or people are saying the U.S. is this horrible imperial power. And, I think as Americans, we always kind of want to defend our country. But, two things can be true at the same time. Like, we can have horrible imperialist tendencies and start wars, but be a force for good in other areas. And I think China that's the right way to think about China too. It's another global superpower, something we haven't seen for a long time. And they've done amazing things, like lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty,
manufacturing,
through their economic expansion. Yeah, but they've done awful things too, like the imprisoning the Uyghurs, kind of taking over Tibet and their kind of Western neighbors. So in terms of this, I honestly don't think there is anything we can do when it comes to fentanyl and the Chinese exports of these drugs. What I say is that we can only control ourselves. We can only control drug use in our country. And so, we can put all the sanctions we want against China. The fact is, we need them more than they need us, especially in the realm of pharmaceuticals and chemicals. Because if China just decided one day to stop production of these pills,
Nana's not getting her pills.
Yeah, it would be tens of thousands of people dead every day. And economically, we're just too interlinked. So we can do all the sanctions we want. We can sort of rattle our sabers. We can do all this stuff. But ultimately, we have to change the way things, drug use happens in the U.S. And you mentioned harm reduction. And ultimately, that, I think, is the only thing that we can control.
I love that answer, and I couldn't agree with you more. I did a post recently on social media about one of the hills that I think I'm establishing myself on, that I would die on, is that we need to do some serious drug reform. If not straight up legalization. I loved Johan Hari's book, Chasing the Scream. If not straight up legalization and regulation, we need real reform, because people need to know what they're consuming. And at the end of the day, it should be all about safety. It should all be about safety. People have a lot of reasons why they've done drugs. From recreational reasons to trying to crush, to self-medicate because of past trauma. There's a bunch of different reasons, but how can we make it safer? You mentioned before stuff about testing, how it's sometimes harder to get tests than it is to actually get fentanyl. Like the test, the strips that you can get, and things like that. I deal with a lot of teenagers, and sometimes teenagers open up about things that they do that they wouldn't want to open up to anyone else about, their parents or something. And I tell them, if you're going to do illegal drugs, do it like a nerd, like a real nerd. Test it again, dose it out, whatever it is. I would prefer that you don't do it, but I go down those roads, even though it might be able to get me in trouble, because all I care about at the end of the day is their safety. And just say no, how dare you punish them? That doesn't work. So what?
Yeah, I think you have the right approach. Yeah, I always talk about this company called the Bunk Police, and they're very easy to Google. And
how do you spell
that? Bunk, B-U-N-K, and then police. Basically, testing to see if your drugs are bunk, and they sell these fentanyl testing strips that you talk about. There's a lot of places you can buy these. They're super cheap. They're just like a pregnancy test, really. You make a solution of your drugs, you dip the strip in, and then if there's one one line there's fentanyl and two lines there's not, or something like that. And that's kind of the quickest and dirtiest thing that you want to do. But the bunk police also sells kits that you can test to see if you really have MDMA, to see if it's really cocaine, if it's really LSD. All of these, really any drug you can think of, they can test for.
That's all legal too. Like no one's cracking down on bunk police, because that's something that I hear, and I get that from teachers too. They're like, wait, like needle exchange programs or drug testing kits, like how can you just sell that, because then you're encouraging drug use? And it's like, ugh, like that's all, you can get that legally. You just go to bunk police.
Yeah, I think so, like Pennsylvania or something weird, it was or even is still banned, but most states, yeah.
Well, I'm from Pennsylvania. It was established by Quakers, so we have weird things. You can't buy a bottle of whiskey from somewhere that's not run by the government. They do it at the state stores and stuff.
Okay, yeah, well there you go. Yeah, but no, I compare it to abstinence education. I mean, we can tell kids not to have sex, and but if we give them condoms, they're probably going to be having sex anyway, so we might as well try to make it safer. And education is the other really important aspect to it too. I think the just say no era that I grew up in basically had me thinking that smoking weed would kill me just as easily as shooting up heroin. And I have young kids, and I'm still formulating exactly how I'm going to talk to them about these issues, but I think it's important to differentiate. I mean, if you have marijuana, if you can smell the buds, if there's this synthetic marijuana that can be a killer in itself, but that's a chemical too, and they just spray it on like sage and dried plant leaves, and so it's supposed to kind of replicate the marijuana experience, but really, if you can smell your weed, it smells like weed, you're gonna be all right. I don't I'm not gonna want my kids like smoking weed every day while their brain's still developing and stuff like you said. But there's a big difference between taking that and taking just like a pill that somebody hands you at a party. And unfortunately, I'm gonna tell them, I remember being in college at a college party, and literally someone I didn't even know like handed me a pill, and I just took it without even asking what it was. And those days are gone. And I think if you are honest with your kids about everything, they're more likely to trust you.
Yeah, that's my approach as well. And and this is that scary. Like that's another reason why I reached out to you, and I'm glad that you're here, is like just sound the alarm. You can't exaggerate the dangers of fentanyl. Like you really, like if you look at the numbers, you talk to people, like it is that scary. We watch movies like in the 80s and stuff like that. Do you ever see a movie RoboCop Part 2?
No.
It's terrible. But there's this drug in that where they like, shoot into their neck, and it's just like, it's so much more potent and powerful and blah, blah, blah. It's like the drug. It's like the most powerful drug. And I remember just being a kid, be like, wow, that's crazy. Why would you do a drug that just like instantly kills you? That's here now. That's a real thing now. And if parents aren't aware of it, teachers aren't aware of it, you have to be aware that it takes very little to just put in any kind of drug, and just a little bit extra or a little bit more, you dose it out of like your typical dose, and now it's a little bit more, or whatever it is, can kill you. And it is killing people. It's that scary.
I think, just like heroin or any other drug, it is possible to use a safe dose of fentanyl. Mm-hmm. The problem is that it's almost impossible for the layperson to measure it properly, to dose it properly, because the problem is hot spots, right? So usually fentanyl is mixed into a dose of heroin. So let's say you've got a small bag of it. The first dose you take might be totally safe, but the next one might have a hot spot which could kill you. And the problem is there's no way to mix it properly. I spoke with this St. Louis ex-fentanyl dealer, and he said they would use a Mr. Coffee machine to really like mix it up, to grind it up so it was uniform. But that was completely ineffective. I mean, if you don't have, like when hospitals administer fentanyl, when pharmacies do it, they have like people who are trained to do this using specialty equipment, and it's not something that anyone else has access to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's almost like you put salt in your food and you don't stir it up a lot. You no salt, no salt. Oh my gosh, all salt. Basically,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Um, so two things that I just want to kind of close out with. I really want your opinion on this. Like, why is this not at the forefront of something that like our Congress is looking at? Is it lack of lobbyists? Is it like what is it? By your estimation?
I think part of it is that people kind of have opioid fatigue. We've been in the opioid crisis for so many years now, and I think at first people this was really alarming, and people were like, heroin is back. It's worse than ever. It's taking not just people on the fringes of society, but like middle class people, 40-year-old,
Celebrities.
50-year-old white men, things like that. Yeah, and but it dragged on, and then fentanyl came in, which is a kind of a harder drug to understand. Most people didn't grow up with it, and even as the problem got worse, the headline people just kind of got dulled to the headlines, which I understand. It's like when you're reading about bad news over and over again, you kind of like it reminds me a little bit of like the Israeli-Palestine
Okay.
conflict, like. I've been reading about that since I was a kid, and it's just this problem never seems to get better. And I always felt like, what can I do, And so I kind of started to tune it out. But with fentanyl, the fact that it's getting worse, it's getting like exponentially worse, and and I would say there is good news though. I mean, attitudes are changing when it comes to, if you would have told me that Trump would have signed criminal justice reform, for example, I would have never believed it. They talked about Trump versus Biden. Biden was the candidate of the crime bill, and Trump signed criminal justice reform. So it's like politics have been flipped on its head, and there, I just saw the magazine, the National Review, and they're like have legalization of marijuana on the cover, like advocating for it. It's become drug legalization is starting to become the issue that everybody can agree on. And I wrote I have a Substack newsletter. It's called Drugs and Hip Hop, and I predicted that psychedelics will be legal in 10 years in this country. I mean, it's happening so fast, and not even just these drugs, but like attitudes towards alcoholism are starting to change. People are starting to see it more as a disease, even in kind of the most remote kind of red states in the country. It's needle exchanges are all over places like Tennessee, Kentucky. I do think that attitudes are starting to come around.
That's awesome. That was my last like question was I always seek the whole cylinder radio thing. I'm looking for seeking disconfirmation. I want the other side. What am I missing? Where are my blind spots? What like are you in favor of drug legalization and regulation personally?
I guess the short answer would be yes, but the long answer is I'm not sure. I also I'm right in the middle of a post about marijuana legalization, and I'm all for like decriminalization of marijuana, and that's come to places all over the country. You're not seeing people put away in prison for sentences for marijuana, small marijuana penalties anymore. You're just not seeing it, and that's great. At the same time, places where marijuana has been fully legalized, there has been negative consequences. And for example, in Colorado, deaths attributed to driving while stoned have increased every year in a big way. And there's no doubt that legalization of marijuana means more people are going to be using it. More young people are going to be using it. And, like we all know, there are much worse drugs. Marijuana is not going to kill you. But is legalization from a public health perspective the best thing that we can do? And I'm not sure that the answer is yes. So I guess my short answer is decriminalization for sure, but I'm not positive about legalization.
The thing about decriminalization though, wouldn't it be that it still doesn't change that it's being made illegally, so you still have the issues with hotspots, you still have the issues with dosing and stuff like that, where if it's legal, at least we have the FDA on it to say like if you want to do some heroin, here's what it is. Like the way we do it in Portugal and things like that. You go to these clinics, these cafes,
Yeah.
they like at least, and they've been very successful with it. Like that, I guess that's the reason why I'm against decriminalization. I think it's a step, maybe it's like a step in the right direction, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be like, you don't know what you're getting. And that's my biggest fear with fentanyl is people are getting it. They don't want it. It's weird. Like you're getting a drug and you don't want this drug. You know?
Yeah. No, there are so many different aspects of it. And another point in favor of legalization is that we want to put the cartels out of business. You know, the sheer amount of murders that happen in Mexico every year relating to the cartels is another aspect of this that doesn't get talked about enough. And you're right that we want to regulate the dosage so that it's for safer use. So you know, I can be brought around to that point, but it's just there's so, you know, and all drugs are not the same. I mean, psychedelics, legalizing psychedelics would be a no-brainer for me right away.
Yeah.
You know, it's something like LSD, magic mushrooms. No one's ever overdosed and died on those drugs.
You want to. You want to die.
Well, yeah, if you are in a bad setting.
Yeah.
But so I just think we, you know, need to actually run studies. I mean, that's been the problem with drug prohibition, is so much of this stuff has not even been studied. But I think that there's starting to be a thaw.
Yeah, when it's Schedule I drug and stuff. That's why it's really positive that Johns Hopkins, who was it, Roland, well, I forget his name. I forget now, but Roland something at Johns Hopkins, they're studying it now. It was funded by Tim Ferriss and others. So I think that's a great step in the right direction. I'm with you. Ben, thank you so much for being here. What are you working on next? Like, what are you on? Because as I started off saying about investigative journalism, I don't trust organizations anymore, like news organizations. I just don't trust them. I don't trust, you know, Rolling Stone, but I do trust Matt Taibbi. You know, like I don't trust, you know, whatever, like these big sources, but I trust journalists, and you're one that I trust. What are you working on next? Because we need it. We need people who are searching for truth and not looking for some sort of partisan, like, gotcha. What are you working on? Anything cool?
I had a little brother in the Big Brother, Big Sister program. My mentee, his name was Jarrell Cleveland, and he was murdered in 2016 in Ferguson, which is right outside St. Louis here. And it's an investigation, my next book, an investigation into how he died and who killed him. It's been an unsolved murder, but I'm almost done actually, and I was able to figure out his case. I figured out, you know, who killed him, and it's a book about our relationship, what happened in his life, and it kind of also zooms out to sort of the bigger picture of the decline of the Midwest and St. Louis, and it should be out May of next year. So.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I'll definitely be promoting that for you in any way that I can. I mean, you're doing the job and the police aren't doing it. Like, you know, I mean, there's something there where, you know, a 16-year-old black kid, I assume he was black.
Yeah, he was 19, yeah.
Oh, 19. A 19-year-old, you know, black kid dies in a tough situation. It's just like, that's not even news. I taught in East LA, and I've had students who were kids who died and didn't get to the paper. It's just like, this is just what life in the hood is like. It's like, no. Like, treat it like someone in Beverly Hills was killed. Like, investigate. But if they're not, then you're stepping up and doing it. I think that's amazing, Ben. That's really cool. I mean, it's
horrible. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right. So, yeah. So where can people see? You said you have a Substack?
Oh, yeah. You can just go to my website. Just Google Ben Westhoff. You'll get to my website. That can take you to my Substack as well. But yeah, drugs and hip hop are kind of the things I've mainly been focused on in my reporting. So.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you for being here. I hope that people are listening, and like everything that I'm trying to do, it's just a nudge. That's what I'm doing as a teacher. Here's some ideas. Here's the baton. Go run with it. Go do something cool. So, so I really, you know, I'm thrilled to have an expert like you on, and I think what you're doing is really important. And I think what you've done throughout your career is really awesome and really important. So it's been an honor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Will.
All right.